Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 19. It is not so beautiful outside. It's a little drippy. And there was ice and slush and stuff until about this morning. Is there still some this morning? Not too much on the road? I haven't been out on the road. Yeah, it's almost all the way off the road. Yeah, we had some snow, some rain. This morning, we're going to look at kingdom behavior. And the reason I say that, the reason I want to preface this is that there is specific mention in this chapter 4 times of the kingdom of heaven. Well, technically it's 3 times because the 4th time is the kingdom of God, but it's the same idea. And so this specific mentions here of the kingdom of heaven is the motivation for these unconventional ethics that Jesus is bringing out here in chapter 19. And of course, the elephant in the room is the ethics of marriage and divorce. And so this lesson is going to cover chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. I tried diligently last night, and I mentioned this in the class, I tried diligently until 10:30 last night at least to try and include 11 and 12 in the lesson, and it was just too big. It was too many slides with too much words to speak, and so we're going to do probably verses 10, 11, and 12 in its own lesson. And then if there's time, I'll add in the rest of the chapter to that lesson. But it's likely we might have 3 lessons coming out here of chapter 19, which is a real departure because normally I do 1 chapter per Sunday with very few exceptions. And so this is one of those exceptions because it has become such a big issue, such a contentious issue, and because it is so important. This is foundational to how we live our lives. This is very practical information, and it's also tied very closely to the last chapter. Chapter 18, it's tied very closely to forgiveness. So, I'm probably going to talk pretty fast because I have a lot of notes on my slide here. So let me just go by the notes and quit talking off my head, and we'll be out of here before 3 or 4 o'clock. So, this kingdom of heaven is the motivation for the unconventional things that Jesus is teaching here. And that mention of the kingdom here is going to draw a contrast between our thoughts and God's thoughts, right? Chapter 16 and verse 23 says, that's 15. Let's try 16 and verse 23. Jesus turned, right, and he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." And another translation would be the things of God, right? And so, the kingdom is contrast with human thoughts. Kingdom thoughts are not the same as human thoughts. And the continual repetition of the word kingdom here in chapter 19, we have it in verse 12, we have it in verse 14, we have it in verse 23, verse 24, and if we really want to look hard, chapter 20 and verse 1 uses the word kingdom also, and could possibly be included with chapter 19. So 4 times, possibly even 5 times, this word is used. It's even used in contrast with the rulers there of this world in chapter 20 and verse 25. Let me read that. And hearing this, the 10 became indignant with the 2 brothers. But Jesus called to them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them." So human rulers lord things over each other, and that is not how it is supposed to be in the kingdom, and especially within marriage. And we're going to see that contrast, but this thought of the kingdom is going to maintain the focus of our attention for the remainder of this trip to Jerusalem. Chapter 19 and verse 1, and it came about that when Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and he came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. He has left Galilee. He's not going back. He will never see Galilee again in this life, possibly after he was resurrected, but he's going to Jerusalem to be crucified. And this is the beginning of the end of that trip. And so, this chapter 19, is all about life in the kingdom and how life in the kingdom and its membership, the members of the kingdom, they act differently from the world. And so Jesus finds within the law of Moses here, the Torah, he finds two different levels of instruction. In Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, we find a provision for dealing with a problem that had already come up. Like, it was already happening, and then Moses regulated that problem. But in Genesis 1 through 2, Jesus gives us a critical piece of the understanding of God, a critical piece of the evidence here, and that is that the first principles of God, as God expressed them through creation, if his disciples, if they observed those first principles, they would have rendered the whole divorce troubleshooting legislation of Deuteronomy unnecessary. It wouldn't have needed to happen. And so Jesus doesn't answer their question of the Pharisees when they come to him and ask him about divorce. He doesn't answer it directly initially, because looking for a cause of divorce is not the root issue. They're looking for a cause for divorce, and that is not the root issue. Not living according to the kingdom of God is the issue. And so Jesus is going to camp out in Genesis and make a little home there for several verses. And he's going to define what humans are. And he's going to define what marriage is. And so this discussion then is about the ethics of the kingdom, how we act, our actions in the kingdom, and how whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual sin, is breaking those ethics because they break the intention of God's creation of mankind. The very reason that we exist, if you break that covenant sexually, you are breaking something so basic to our existence that relationship is broken. Let me just go on, because I'm getting lost in my spiel here. So this is an overview of all of the slides. If you want to pause the video at some future date, if you're listening live, I would not recommend that you pause it actually right now. I'm not going to go over this slide right now, but I will in the future. I have a handout here. If you want a handout, if you're local, I can get you one. This slide is conclusions that can only be drawn from chapter 19. So this is what's called an exegetical outline, and this comes from a book. I can show you the book if you want. It's not too understandable unless you know Greek, but this is a list of conclusions that can only be drawn from chapter 19 in Matthew. And so this needs to be the basis of where we take this passage. It doesn't need to be, well, I think it relates to this verse, and this verse over here, and this verse. And we take all these 5 verses, we smush them together into one belief, and that's what Matthew 19 is saying. Well, that's not what's going on. We need to stick within the context here and understand what this passage means first, and then we can go and make the application. So this morning's lesson is only going to be understanding what is in Matthew 19. I am not going to go over every single situation in our lives that arise. I'm only going to be going over what Matthew 19 says this morning. So, verses 1 through 2, we read verse 1. So, he came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. So, when he says Judea, he's referring to the Roman province of Judea here, because Judea didn't go, Judah, the tribe of Judah's territory, did not go beyond the Jordan, right? And so we know that he's referring to the Roman territory here. It's questionable as to whether even the Roman territory went beyond Judea, but that's another question for another day. So, the point is that great multitudes were following him from Galilee. And they were following him, and he healed them there. This sounds like just like a little side note. And he healed them there. 5 little words that if we have been studying the first half of Matthew should be of critical importance to us, because that is how he was showing the kingdom was coming in himself and in his actions, was by those healings. Okay, so there's a general situation that's going on here, and the first one is that Jesus is very popular in Herod's territory. And you know who else was popular in Herod's territory? John the Baptist. Why did John the Baptist die? He died for his belief on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He told Herod he was not allowed to have his brother's wife. Well, why not? She divorced her husband. She went over and had this other one. John the Baptist died because of his view on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And Jesus tells us that he holds the same view, and he expounds on that here in Matthew 19. Jesus has been proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven was arriving in himself and his actions for the last 19 chapters. Well, at least for 3 minus 19. 3 minus 9 is 6. There we go. For the last 16 chapters, Jesus has been proclaiming the kingdom of God in his actions. And so this chapter, above all the other chapters, tells us how our actions need to be, at what our actions need to look like if we're going to be part of that kingdom family. I mean, Jesus uses the word kingdom 4 times just in this chapter. And just last week in chapter 18, he used it 4 times as well, right? 8 times in the same speech that we have divided ourselves up into 2 chapters. 8 times. So these chapters are clearly, without exception, these chapters are about kingdom behavior. And so if we want to conform our lives to live in that kingdom, we have to pay special attention to these chapters. All right, let's keep going. That was the general situation. The immediate situation here in verse 3 now says that, and some Pharisees came to him, testing him, so that probably is indicating motive, testing him and saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? So, the immediate situation is that there is this insidious attempt by the Pharisees to embroil Jesus in controversy. Now, this was not just Jesus. They did this to everyone. They were just cannibals. They ate themselves. If one of their teachers couldn't hold up to the pressure of their questions, he fell from grace, essentially. And so they were just cannibals. And so this is actually a lesson for us in the church. We need to have grace and we need to have mercy when we're studying with somebody that we disagree with, and not treat them like the Pharisees did. Anyway, insidious attempt to embroil Jesus in this controversy, especially here, over divorce. And so the background to this question is that Israel is rescued from captivity. Let's think about this from their mindset. Israel is rescued from captivity in Egypt, and we have this great and powerful victory by God, And the storyline is going, and these great things are happening, and it stops for a year when they're at Sinai. And God starts giving all these laws to Israel. 613 of them, right? It starts with 10, and then there's 603 more, right? And out of those 613 commandments, designed to set Israel apart from the nations. That's why this law was given, to set them apart from the nations. Exactly two give any guidance at all about divorce. One of them, the first one I want to look at this morning, is Exodus chapter 21. And I'm not going to mention this again after this section, because Exodus 21 is not actually mentioned in Matthew 19. I just thought it was important that we mention the 2 times in the Torah, in the law of Moses, that it's mentioned. If he takes for himself another woman, Exodus chapter 21 and verse 10. If he takes for himself another woman, so this is a regulation regarding a second wife. If he takes for himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or, and English versions are very bashful, and they say conjugal rights. Just a forewarning, this morning's lesson is going to include such words as sex. There's going to be lots of sex in this lesson, actually, and there's going to be some graphic words also, because that's what Jesus is referring to in his teaching on these concepts. So, here we are, Exodus 21, but it really only applies to a second wife. And when we find law in the Bible, we should never compare this to a modern law, right? This is a terrible mistake we often make, because we want to look at it through our 21st century lenses, right? With the way I think about law, God gave these laws to set Israel apart from the nations. And this is important. These laws did not represent God's moral ideal for the world or for all time, for that matter. Hebrews says, right, if the law was perfect, we would have no need for Jesus. What does that mean? It means the law isn't perfect. God is working, these laws, they represent God working with Israel as he found them after centuries of slavery in Egypt, right? These were different people. They didn't have a written law. So here we are, ancient culture, right? Patriarchally ruled, male ruled, a culture that practices polygamy. Which gender, might you take a wild guess, would get the short end of the stick? Even with just 2 seconds of thought, right? We can see how men could and did acquire wives like property. Right? Solomon being probably the most famous. So God gives Exodus 21 here to minimize that. He cannot neglect or abuse the first wife. Right? And it doesn't jump out at us necessarily, but whose dignity does this law protect? Whose dignity does this law protect? And the only option that it could be is that it protects the woman's dignity. It doesn't move them towards a 21st century view of marriage. This law does not do that. But that's very presumptuous of ourselves to think that, right? That somehow our view of marriage in America is the best view, right? But this law does push Israel towards a greater principle of wisdom and justice for everyone, for all of mankind, and especially the vulnerable, in this case, a woman. And so the principle is this. The principle is that if a man breaks the covenant promise that he has made with this woman, especially over food or clothing or sex, she's free to go. She's free to go. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about another situation or anything else. And of course, this is regulating a second marriage. This is not the first marriage. It's complicating things. But let's keep going because I want to get back to the context here. Let's read Deuteronomy chapter 24. Because the Pharisees, when they asked the question here, let me just read the question again in Matthew chapter 19. And so Pharisees came to him, testing him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all?" Is it lawful? Let's read Deuteronomy 24 and try to see where they came up with that question. When a man takes a wife and marries her, I'm trying very hard not to comment as I go along. If a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter husband turns against her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, then, this is the new law that's now being said. All those other things have just happened. This is the new regulation. Then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. What is this law about? What is this law about? Does this law in any way regulate divorce? There is no regulation of divorce in this law at all. What was the Pharisees' question? The Pharisees' question was a regulation about divorce. But you see, there wasn't a regulation about divorce, not a clear one anyway, word for word, in the law of Moses. So what is this law about? This law is about remarriage. This law assumes a divorce has already taken place. And this is going to be key to understanding where Jesus is coming from in his reply to the Pharisees. This law was the source of their argument there in Matthew 19. In Jesus' day. Why was this an argument? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's that one ambiguous word, some indecency. That word, unfortunately, never appears again in all of Hebrew literature. In all of the Hebrew scriptures that we have, that word does not appear. This is the only place that it appears in Hebrew scripture. How do we know what words mean? How do we know what words mean? Well, people who write dictionaries go and they look up every place that that word is ever used, and they write it down. And then they coalesce those into a definition. You can't do that when there's only one word, and it's only once ever used. So there's ambiguity there. And so this phrase, some indecency, means this phrase doesn't have a clear meaning. And I mean, welcome to the debate. This was a debate in their day, and it's a debate in our day. And there were two, let me just give you some more background here. There were two main rabbinical schools of thought. We went through this during the class. Rabbi Shammai took Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 24, and he smushed them together and said that the indecency must be sexually related, although his definition of sexual, right, is not what you might think it is, right? What about going outside with your hair unfastened, if you were a woman? That was sexual indecency to Rabbi Shammai. Or spinning around with a cloth in your hand and your armpits being shown, if you're a woman, that was sexual indecency. And so we can see that even when we try and reduce the views of the quote-unquote conservative people, they didn't match up with what Jesus taught. And so the second school of thought, the quote-unquote liberal view, was Rabbi Hillel. And he took the more lenient view, right? We still have the lists of what Rabbi Hillel taught because his teaching was very popular. Can you guess what it was? Right? The most famous teaching that he taught was that if a woman burned the bread, or more likely dinner, that was grounds for divorce. That was considered indecent. Right? So stop for a second and think through this with me. This was a view that says only, both of these views were a view that say that only men could initiate a divorce. And they can do so for any and every cause. And I want us to stop and think of the implications of that. Think of the type of culture that would produce. And then realize that, is it any surprise to us that this was the most popular view during Jesus' day? Right? Jesus and the disciples have grown up in a society where men could divorce their wives for any and every reason, but women could not do the same. And I want you to stop and think about what that means for Jesus when they ask him to weigh in on the debate. Jesus doesn't answer their question because looking for a cause of divorce is not the root issue. I've already said this, right? What Jesus thought was the root issue was that they did not understand what humans are in relation to God. And they did not understand what marriage was or is. So let's hop into Jesus' response here in verse 4. So Jesus straight up asks the most learned Hebrew scholars in the area if they've ever read their Bible. This would be like asking a doctor if he's ever done any training. Have you ever done any training medically? This was an insult. Because if they had read their Bible, their Hebrew Bible, their Torah, their Tanakh, the rest of the writings, they would know the story that is on page 1 and 2 of the Torah. Right? And Jesus is going to reflect what the meaning of marriage and the human existence is, the very essence of it, and he does it in a way that he always does when he's asked about sex, when he's asked about marriage, when he's asked about divorce or gender. He always appeals to page 1 and 2 of the creation narrative that we have in Genesis. So let's read Jesus' response in verse 4 through 6. And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife," or to be joined to his wife, "and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." The last 5 words there are the answer to the question. But there's a whole lot more words that are the answer to the reason they're asking the question. So Jesus says, let's go back and think about things here. Here's something from page 1 of the Bible. From the beginning, God made male and female. And then he said on page 2, he said, the reason a man leaves is so that the two can become one. And this is the very center of the debate for Jesus. He will not enter into debates about Who's on what's list for what for divorce? He will not enter into that debate. He refuses. And I think that this is a very critical point here. Jesus says that according to the kingdom of God, here is what humans are. And here is what marriage is. And if you get that point right, when the controversies like divorce come, you will know how to handle those things because you follow after the path of Jesus. Let me read something from 1 Peter real quick. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. And this is critical to think about this because we need to think about what Peter means here. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21. Christ is our example. Verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving for you an example, or leaving an example for you to follow in his steps. He who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, being kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. We need to follow in the steps of Christ. And what that means is that we need to conform our behavior to the behavior of the kingdom. And so this point is critical to Jesus. He says that according to the kingdom of God, here's what humans are. Here is what marriage is. And if you get those things right, you will know how to handle those things that come up like divorce because you have the correct starting point. Because, and the lesson for us is, because we follow after Jesus in his steps, we have the correct starting point to understand what marriage is. So, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27 through 28. I have it here on the slide behind me if you want to read it. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Jesus, of course, only quotes here the last part of this, but like every time Jesus quotes anything, he assumes you know the context. The image of God here in the scriptures is a poem of which male and female is the last part of that poem. Jesus assumes you know the whole poem when he quotes this. And so, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. We're going to get a little clearer picture of that when we look at verse 5, because Jesus quotes chapter 2 of Genesis. But let's go back. What is this poem about that Jesus is quoting the last line of here? What is this poem about? Well, let's think about it from Israel's perspective, especially. What was one of the very first of the 10 commandments that he gives them? God forbid Israel to ever make an image of himself. You could not make an image of God. That word image is the same word that's used here that God can make. God can make little idols of himself. He can make images. He can make representations of himself. And what is that image? That image is you and me. It is male and female. God says, don't make idols to Israel, right? But literally, the same word here in Genesis is used when he makes humanity. You are the image of God. And so, how many did God create here in chapter 1, in verse 27 here? So God created man, singular. In the image of God, he created him. Him is singular also. He created him. One. He created one. He created one kind. And what's the word for, the Hebrew word for that one kind of individual that he created? The Hebrew word for human or humanity is Adam. He created Adam. He created one humanity, and that he says that humanity is made up of male and female. Adam means human or humanity in Hebrew, and so God made humanity. He made Adam in his image. And how many species of humans did God make? He made one. He made him. So God created this uniquely qualified species to fulfill a calling that he was going to put into them to bear his image, to reflect God out into the creation, into this world that he has made for them. This is what Jesus is referring to when he uses those two little words, male and female. I guess that's three if you count and. Male and female is referring to reflecting God as the image out into the world. We're going to see how that fits together here in the next slide, because this is where Jesus begins to draw his example of the meaning of what it is to be a human, right? This poem claims that God created one humanity, but what does that one humanity consist of? That one humanity consists of two, male and female. They're gendered opposites. And so we could have a discussion about what gender is and what a spectrum of gender is and all those things, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here. If we want to talk about those things, there's a time and a place, but right now is coming from the point of Matthew 19. This is not what Jesus is talking about. So, one humanity consisting of gendered opposites, but there's something really remarkable about humans that when two of them come together and have sex, they make more humans, right? I hope nobody's learning here anything this morning. Do you see, though, what this poem is saying here in Genesis 1? The one God becomes two, who then become one again, and what happens? More humans. So there's something about this one humanity that is yet two, but when the two become one in a covenant of love and marriage, new life is generated out into the world. And that particular instance is called the image of God. One God that is made up of a number of complexities. However we want to look at that, whatever name we want to use for that, the Trinity, whatever you want to call it, God is this complex being that is going to be revealed over a time period, over the storyline of the Bible. He's going to be revealed to us through the covenants that he has with people that then creates life for his people. Those covenants that are full of covenantal love that generates new life. Are we all tracking there? Are we all got it so far? Okay, good. Let's look at the next verse then, verse 5. So we as humans we could have sex like rabbits and reproduce all over the place, right? But that isn't the human higher calling, right? That isn't the calling that reflects the image of God. What reflects the image of God is when two of them leave their mother and father and form a new family, not just by having sex. That's not how you form a family. The way you form a family here is by a promise, by a covenant. And so this is most beautifully mentioned or represented in the Proverbs, in the prophets, right? When they talk about the covenant that God has made with them. And sometimes it's talked about in a very negative way because Israel has broken their covenant with God, right? So to form a new family, let me just back up a little. To form a new family, you don't do that just by having sex, but a promise, a covenant, right? And there's many things in the Proverbs that are mentioned that are beautiful about that. And even in the writings of the prophets, like the book that no one in the church mentions, right? Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. So new families are created simply by the uttering of covenant promises. The two become a beautiful unity, just like God is. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is Israel. I mentioned this in the class. Israel became a covenant people, became a unity with God at Sinai, where God makes this marriage covenant with them. And so what do those promises look like for us? Well, just look back at Exodus 21, right, that we read. It means I'm going to bind everything that I have, everything that I care for, and I'm going to feed and clothe and have sex with and bind my life and my love and my body with this person of the opposite gender for the rest of my life. That's what Jesus says here. As humans, we are different. We are the image of God. We reflect God. And so when Jesus says a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, they shall become one flesh. We all know the word meat cleaver, right? Bam, chop through a big chunk of meat. Well, the opposite of that would be to cleave them back together. We don't quite understand that intuitively, right? Because once it's cut, it's cut. Jesus is saying that if you could pull the knife, run the tape in reverse, pull the knife out, and heal it back together into one, you would not even see a line of separation, right? You wouldn't see where the cleaver cut. So as humans, we are different. We are the image of God. We reflect God. And when we come back together, when we come together as male and female into one flesh, we are the crown of life, the picture of the crown of life here on the planet Earth. Animals are not like us. We're not a kangaroo. We're not rabbits, right? Humans are different. We are the image of God. We reflect who God is and what that relationship, that relational status is that we have with God. And when we come together as male and female into one flesh, we are the pinnacle of what life should look like here on earth. But there's always this draw for us, right? Especially for men. We have this thing called testosterone in us, and it causes us to do dumb things. And if we listen to that little person sitting on our shoulder, right, who's giving us bad advice all the time, we would just go out and breed like rabbits. But in Jesus' view, the thing that makes us different as humans is our higher human calling to be the image of God, rising above that impulse, right? We make a covenant promise of lifelong love to a member of the opposite sex or the opposite gender. And new humans are created within that opposite gender. New humans are created within the context of commitment and promise and love, and that is a symbol of God's own love. It's a reflection of God's own love for us. And so Jesus says that Jesus is saying that view will affect your view of everything else, especially regarding sex and marriage and divorce. And so marriage is the sacred symbol that points all of us to God's nature as a being of covenant love. And Jesus says that this bond of marriage is so sacred that it should never be broken for any cause, or any and every cause, I should say. And boom, right? We're back in the debate again, because we're back to the topic at hand. That bond is so sacred that it should never be broken for any and every cause. And so, Jesus' point here is not we need to look for reasons for divorce, but we need to start looking for reasons to keep our wife. And the Pharisees, they say we do read our Bible. They say, look, Jesus, Moses commanded divorce. Right? And Jesus totally and completely disagrees with them. Moses did not command divorce. He permitted divorce. And Jesus says something extremely profound here. Let me just read what they say in verse 7. Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Jesus totally and completely disagrees with the Pharisees. Moses did not command divorce, he permits it. He says that the law of Moses was not, and I want you to understand, this is important. Jesus says that the law of Moses was not God's ideal moral standard for all of human existence, or for even for all humans. It was designed for Israel to set them apart from the nations. And I want you to let that sink in for just a minute. The purpose of the law of Moses, the purpose of the law is that he finds Israel as he found them, as slaves in Egypt, and he's working with them in their ancient context and in their fallen state, and he pushes them towards greater justice and mercy and care for each other. That is what the law of Moses is about. It's not about being a perfect moral standard for all time. It's just not. And if we want to debate about that, we can talk about Hebrews where it says it's not perfect. So, let's keep going. That was verse 7 and 8. And here comes the big one, of course. Jesus says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. There's two things we need to look at right here. The except for sexual immorality, that word is porneia. It should sound familiar. Pornography gets it from the same root word. The word means, and if you want to look it up, you can look it up in Thayer's, or I have a Vine's dictionary right here. You can look it up for yourself. It means sexual immorality or sex outside of the marriage context, but it means something even more than that. It can mean anything relating to sexual activity. So it could be incest, it could be bestiality, it could be adultery, it could be sex with two unmarried people. And so Jesus is going to directly respond now by giving his view on this debate. Let me define the other word here. The other word is adultery, and that means having sex with somebody who is married. So there's two words that are used here. The first one Fornication, in the King James, is sexual immorality. It means any illicit sexual activity outside of marriage. That's what it means. Adultery is having sex with somebody who is married. Okay. So, Jesus is now responding very directly to the debate. And he very directly states his own view on the disputed word that we talked about in Deuteronomy 24, that some uncleanness. And he says that some uncleanness means, sexual immorality. And Jesus says, don't go to the law of God here. Don't go to the law of Moses for God's vision for mankind representing him, representing God. He says, don't go to the law of Moses to get a picture of what it means to represent God. The law of Moses was dealing with fallen and broken people in the situation where they were at. Jesus says, don't go to that to get an accurate picture of what God looks like. He says, go to page 1 and 2. If you want to see how God works in a bad situation and chooses the lesser of two evils, look at Deuteronomy 24. He says, if you want to know what marriage is and what humans are and what humans are for and what marriage is for, go to pages 1 and 2. And so this passage has extremely significant implications for how we as humans deal with and talk about divorce and remarriage and what constitutes grounds for divorce. And if I'm going to call myself a Christian, if I'm going to call myself a follower of Jesus, I have to conform my life to these principles of the kingdom. And that is not always easy. Many times it is difficult. And divorce is this extremely painful event that always has sin involved, right? It's not always on both sides of the event, but Jesus is not giving an excursus or a complete discourse on every situation that comes up in a married person's life. We need to keep the context of what Jesus is saying and the question he's being asked, and we need to make the application that Jesus did. And if we're going to apply this to other situations, that's fine. We can do that in combination with other places. But this morning, that's not what I'm doing. I want you to understand that. I am saying what Jesus said in chapter 19, and that's all I'm saying. Jesus says that the matter of indecency in Deuteronomy 24 is only sexual immorality. If you burn the bread, that is not grounds for divorce. That's what Jesus says. Which, for Jesus, the sexual immorality part means having sex with somebody that you are not in a marriage covenant with, between a man and a woman. And so this result here in verse 9 of this declaration about divorce and remarriage is not, you got to remember, it's not brought about by Jesus referring to Scripture again. He doesn't go and say, well, see, therefore, Deuteronomy 24 means this. He defines what that is, but what does he say? He says, but I tell you. Uh-oh. He doesn't say Moses said. He doesn't say Aaron said or, the prophets say. He says, I say to you. This is the same thing he said in Matthew chapter 5 when he says almost exactly the same thing in Matthew chapter 5 without the exception here on the end. He says, let's look at that real quick. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 31. And 32. And it was said, whoever sends away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, that's the same word there, sexual immorality, and makes her commit adultery, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus is saying the same thing here as he did in chapter 19. Let me make a quick side note, because some people will say, well, see, sending away and divorce is different. The problem is, it is translated differently in the King James. That is correct. The problem is, it is the same exact word in the Greek in both verses. So you cannot claim that sending away is different from divorce. All right, let's move back to our argument here, because Jesus in chapter 19 here has this final resulting declaration that he's making, and it's not a reference back to Scripture. He says, I tell you, but I tell you. He's telling them something different. Just like in chapter 5, we have 6 or 7 times when Jesus quotes the law, and then he says, but I tell you something different. Jesus is bringing to the table something new. Jesus is bringing something new to the table, and he's doing it by the authority of God. All right, let's keep going. So verse 9, we're still in verse 9. He says that marriage should not be terminated except for sexual unfaithfulness. And that if it is terminated for any other cause, the subsequent marriage of either party there is adultery or is adulterous. That's sometimes a nuance that we don't make. The word commits adultery is in the present tense, but it's what's known as a progressive verb. When it commits adultery is all one word in the Greek. And there is no other option but to translate that as extending into the future. This is not adultery happens when they first get married and have sex and then everything after that is okay. This is a marriage that should not be taking place. That's the bottom line with what Jesus says here. And so the disciples are stunned, right? They're stunned. Jesus' own disciples. It doesn't even talk about what the Pharisees say, right? Jesus starts from the one flesh of Genesis chapter 2, right? The two shall become one flesh. And it's only because of sexual unfaithfulness, sexual immorality. It's only because sexual immorality has already broken that unity, that the marriage must be regarded as no longer intact. And so the Pharisees were concerned about the man's right to initiate a divorce. Do you see the difference between what the Pharisees taught and what Jesus is teaching? If all this seems very far away, in a land far away and distant to our own culture and our own culture's view on divorce rates, you would be absolutely correct. Because our divorce rate, while it is soaring, I mentioned this in the class, it is soaring, it is now about on par with what the divorce rate likely was in the first century. Because believe it or not, it's actually easier in the first century to get a divorce than it is nowadays. Nowadays, we have divorce for any reason. What was the teaching of Hillel? Divorce for any reason. We have this widespread assumption, right, that marriages are most not likely not going to last for the rest of your life in our society now. That you could try, but it's most likely not going to happen, right? That was a widespread assumption for this culture, right? Because what is the purpose of marriage, according to Hillel, according to his interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 24? What is the purpose of marriage? The purpose of marriage is to make the man happy, because he finds no favor in her eyes. In a culture that treats women like property, it should not be a surprise to us that they would then be discarded like property. The question is, am I talking about the 1st century or the 21st century? I'll let you decide. This teaching was no less radical in Jesus' world, in Jesus' day, than it is in our day. There was a widespread assumption, like I said, that marriages were not or could not be expected to last for life. And divorce was even easier in their day, except that in their day, divorce was only the prerogative of the man. And so Jesus is laying down a challenge to the accepted norms. He is demanding a complete rethink of what marriage is on the basis not of what human convenience is, not of what society expects of us, but on the purpose of God creating human beings in the meaning of our existence. We have to remember that a major aspect of what we're looking at here, and that we often miss because we have these 21st century goggles on, is that let me make the point by asking a question. Who is Jesus standing up here for? Who is he standing up for? Jesus embeds this argument in the creation narrative because he is talking to people who, in his mind, are perpetrating injustice and oppression through their distorted views, especially towards women. I've already mentioned it, but I have a whole slide on this. What is the Pharisees' view of marriage? Marriage exists to please men. Deuteronomy 24, their view of that was that, that some indecency is not pleasing me, whatever that is. Does this view sound familiar to us? The world we live in, right? This sounds a lot like the world we live in. Only it's no longer only for men doing that in the 21st century now. It's now equality. Women can also view marriage with an eye to, it only exists to please me. When a man can end a marriage because his wife is displeasing to him, for any reason, and a woman cannot, what results is a distorted worldview. You have men treating women like property, and what do we do with property that is no longer pleasing to us? We get rid of it, we sell it, we throw it away, whatever it is. We have no problem with doing that to property. That's how they viewed women in the 1st century. And so, how does that contrast with Jesus' view of marriage? Jesus' view of marriage is that it is sacred, right? It provides an image. Marriage is an image of the covenant love of God. And male and female, they are one. God makes one humanity, and they come and make male and female, and they come together, and they vow this covenant love for each other, and a new life is generated. And so the purpose of marriage is compromised by a view that says marriage can only be broken for any reason. The purpose of marriage is compromised by a view of marriage that says that the marriage covenant can be broken for any reason. Now, I have a side note to this because Jesus has a side note to this in the next few verses, and this is the part that I didn't get to. I'm glad I cut it now because we're already at an hour. Sorry. But Marriage, let me ask a question. Let me do this by asking a question. I've done that a lot this morning. Is marriage the only way to reflect the love of God into the world? Jesus says no. And he is the very epitome of that. He was never married. And he is probably he is the most perfect image of the love of God come to the world to reflect it out. So we're going to find that out in the next few verses, right? That commonly held belief, especially in the church. I'm not accusing anybody here individually, but the common overarching belief and the way we act towards single people is to pressure them, especially young adults, into getting married. You see a nice young lady come in who's 25. She comes in, and what's the first question? Are you married? I have a son over here who would like to get married. Would you like to marry him? I mean, we don't say it like that, but that's how it is. And so we pressure people into getting married because that's what happiness and fulfillment is all about, right? It's found in marriage. That's not what Jesus says. He says something quite the opposite. He says, there were also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven, some people choose to not find happiness in marriage, in sex, in procreation, and Jesus says that that is a higher calling. There will be even more sex talk next week, because we've got to talk about what a eunuch is and how that relates. And so as we look at, we're going to look next week at what it means to find happiness outside of sex in our lives. And it is possible, trust me. Despite what the TV tells you, it is possible. We live in the most, I don't even know how to say it. We live in the most sexually penetrated society of all time. Everything you turn on the TV, and I guarantee within 5 minutes there will be something sexually oriented on the TV. Whether it's a toothbrush commercial from a lady in a bikini or whatever it is, there will always be something sexually related. And so our society has told us that sex is this highest form of pleasure and happiness. And what does it bring in our life? Pain and destruction. Our society tells us that true happiness is found in marriage. And then we get to be married, and we find out that marriage is about sleep deprivation and sacrifice. And compromise with our spouse. True happiness is not found in external circumstances. True happiness is found in realizing our created intention as human beings to be reflections of the image of God. And I want to leave you with that thought this morning, is that if you haven't been true to that reflection, that image of God, you need to be. You need to make a decision to follow after God. And this is not some like big ceremony thing that needs to happen like you might see in some other churches around. This is a personal decision that you make. You have to decide, yeah, you know what? I'm going to live my life differently. I'm going to decide to follow what God has intended for us. He has intended for us to be reflections of himself. And I'm going to do that. And it starts with a decision to do that. And once you decide to do that, you have to make changes in your life and say, you know what? I'm not going to be involved in those types of actions anymore. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to live my life differently now. And when you do that, you can have your previous faults and sins washed away by the blood of Christ in baptism. And if you need that this morning, or maybe you've already done that, and maybe something in your life, whether it's divorce or whatever it is, has taken you away from God, and you want to come back to God, we can help you with that also. Please, please, if you need to contact us, my phone number is 252-2141, or you can contact us at sitkachurch@gmail.com if you're online. Please, please, if you need anything, contact us and we can help you get back into that right relationship with God, how He intended things to be from page 1 and page 2 of the Bible. If you need anything like that, just let us know. Next week, Matthew chapter 19, and starting in verse 10. Have a good morning, everyone.